So in the last video we defined this new type of number which we called complex numbers, and I'd like to show you how we can define a structure on these numbers. So recall that a complex number is any number of the form x plus iy where x and y are real numbers, and you combine them in this way. And this I thing right here satisfies I squared equals minus 1. And remember, we had to introduce this to solve the equation x squared equals minus 1. So how do we define a structure on these numbers? Does it make sense to add or subtract or multiply or even divide one complex number by another? Well, it turns out that it does make sense, and here's how we do it. So suppose I've got two different complex numbers. So suppose I've got one complex number z1. Remember, I like to use z or w for complex numbers. z1 is equal to x1 plus I y1. So here x1 and y1 are just any real numbers, and I is the imaginary unit, which I've defined up here. So z1 is this complex number. I'm also going to define z2 to be the complex number x2 plus I times y2. Then what do I mean by z1 plus z2? How do I define addition on the complex numbers? Well, here's how we do it. Well, first we add up the real parts. So the addition of the real parts is just x1 plus x2, and then we add the imaginary parts. So the imaginary parts are y1 and y2, so we got plus I times y1 plus y2. So that's how we add complex numbers together. So we add up the real parts, x1 and x2, and then we add up the imaginary parts and multiply everything by I. So that's how we add complex numbers. Let's look at some examples. So let's try to add 3 plus 4i plus 2 plus 6i. What happens when I add these together? Well, if I put the real and imaginary parts together, this is the same as 3 plus 2, that's the sum of the real parts, plus 4i plus 6i. Well, 3 plus 2 is just 5, and 4i plus 6i is just 10i. So the sum of 3 plus 4i and 2 plus 6i, two different complex numbers, gives us a new complex number. So that's the result of adding two complex numbers. And this is fairly simple, so I'll show you one more example. I'll use subtraction this time. So let's look at, maybe I'll try something like 2 minus the complex number 3 plus 9i. What's 2 minus 3 plus 9i? Well, let's put the real and imaginary parts together. Remember that this is still a complex number, it just has an imaginary part of 0. You can sort of think of this as 2 plus 0i. So let's see what happens. So we've got 2 minus 3, and we've got plus 0i minus 9i. Remember that this is a complex number with a 0 imaginary part. And so we've got 2 minus 3 is minus 1. And 0i minus 9i is just minus 9i. So 2 minus this complex number gives us this complex number. So that's how we add or subtract complex numbers.